Mic check. All right. Okay. Good. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. We're going to go ahead and get started with this session, which is Victims and Justice Reinvestment in Oregon. We're very glad you're here. Happy to have you here. I'm very happy to welcome our two speakers for this afternoon. We have Lorie Brisbin from the National Institute of Corrections here from DC. Thank you for making the trip and also making a shorter trip from Multnomah County. We have Denise Pena from Multnomah County Department of Community Justice, Victim Services Unit. Thank you.
Is this on? Oh, it is on. Okay. So I'm just going to ask you if you would like to move up a little closer. We're not going to make you, but if anybody would like to move closer, we would like that better because then I can actually see what you're doing. So thank you so much for coming to this workshop today. I'm extremely happy to be here. It's wonderful to be outside the Beltway for a few minutes. If anybody's been watching the news, which I know probably most of you are not, there's a lot going on in DC. So it's wonderful to be out with some real people who are doing real work and getting a chance to talk to you all. So thank you for having me, really. So we have NIC. How many people are familiar with our organization? So a few of you are. Okay, the National Institute of Corrections is a work unit of the Department of Justice, but we actually sit inside the Federal Bureau of Prisons. And our statutory mandate is to serve state, county, and local agencies who deal with corrections and community supervision. So that's all we do, is training and technical assistance for that segment of the system. Right? We do a little bit of stuff with law enforcement because it laps over into the jails, some other things like that, but mostly we just work with corrections and detention. So I have the privilege of working on a couple of different types of initiatives. One of those is the Victims Services in Post-Conviction Settings. Now, we don't do direct victim services. What we do is serve the people who are serving the victims. So in other words, we provide training opportunities and all kinds of resources for people who are doing the work. So our mission is to kind of help people become more professional, get the training that they need, get the services that they need. We also do technical assistance for very specific targeted projects, with this kind of how Denise and I met. And we'll be talking about the Oregon project when we get a little farther into this. So if we could kind of get a show of hands of who's in the room. How many advocates do we have? So just a couple? Okay, who else is here? Law enforcement? Corrections?
Treatment providers? One, all right.
A few of you? Okay, who else is in here? Okay, so a volunteer organization here in Oregon. Yes, ma'am. Oh, wonderful. Welcome to SANE. Thank you for being here. Yes, sir. County Commissioner? Oh, parole board. Excellent. Wonderful. Wonderful. Okay. Well, I'm glad we sort of have a mixed group of people. This will make it a lot more interesting. And if you didn't already pick up on this is going to be somewhat informal. And I hope that you will contribute to the conversation and ask questions as they come up. Anything else before?
Yes. One of the things that I wanted to say about why I am so in gratitude to Lorie and the work she's doing at NIC is because it seems that when it comes to advocacy for crime victims, generally speaking, it tends to be more on the front end, where a victim can get advocacy in the community, at the DA's office, and essentially as they move through the criminal justice system and move into the post-conviction, which tends to be the most unknown and probably a very complicated system, that's where the support for that victim is probably going to end for a lot of them as they move into the post-conviction world. And so when I first started doing this work about 4 years ago, so a little bit more about me, I work for Multnomah County Parole and Probation Department. I was a parole officer, probation officer for about 8 years in the domestic violence unit before they got me moved over to look and explore victim services in our department, which we honestly didn't have, and that is a theme amongst a lot of the counties here in Oregon, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But prior to that, and the reason they asked me to do it, I think, is because I, prior to becoming a PO, worked at the district attorney's office in Multnomah County as a victim advocate. And so when I moved into probation and parole, I was somebody who I thought I was pretty well informed in terms of victims' rights and what they are, because that was my job for about 5 years. And I was a PO, and then when they started asking me to look for post-conviction, I realized I had no idea because that was never an area that I had focused on. And so I think for a lot of times when victims are getting support and information regarding their rights, because their rights actually extend post-conviction, and I think this is where the gaps start happening for victims in our community because they don't know what they are. And it's really just not talked about, and it's really not well known, to be honest. And so I am excited when I met Lorie and found that there's others of us out there in the post-conviction world doing the work, but it still seems to be the minority. It still seems that most of the focus and resources and money is going to be on the front end, which obviously is something that is very important and crucial. But for the victim, their experience and their trauma and their questions and the information they want and need isn't going to end at conviction. And so hopefully we're here to kind of just focus more on the post-conviction world because, again, for the victims, it's not going to end for them there. And again, if we have any questions as Lorie and I are going on, please feel free to raise your hand. And this is being recorded, hence the mics, and so we will be running a microphone out as well.
Thanks, Denise. So she kind of described how she got into this work. I just want to tell you that back in 2012, I was invited to come to a conference for a group I have never heard of before. They have since changed their name, but at that time they were known as NAVSPIC. Now, it was a huge joke, and nobody thought they should be called that. And now they're known as NAVAC, N-A-V-A-C, right? And I went to the conference, and I just kind of sat in the back of the room like a little mouse and listened to everything that they were saying and how they were struggling so hard, because in many DOCs, there's one person doing this work for the entire department. Now, that's not true in California. They have an entire office. I think they're up to 26 coordinators now. So in the larger states, there'll be a work unit, but in many, many cases, it's just a single person. Now, the skill set that they're required to have go from the very minimum, which is notification, and many of you are familiar with VINE or APRIS. Okay, that's the very minimum, right? Clear over to escorting victims to executions and preparing them for that experience. So you can see this as a huge, wide range of skills and abilities that these folks are required to have, with almost zero support inside of their agencies, really. So when I was done at that conference, I sort of stood up and I said, NIC has the ability to help you. We have these things called networks, and we can put this together so that you will be able to talk to each other on a private online forum, which we now have, and Denise is a member of that. And so all 50 states participate in that now to help each other, ostensibly so they don't have to reinvent the wheel. So it's great to have that group of people. And like in Denise's case, we've invited a few larger counties who are doing excellent work. We've also invited a few parole boards who have done some extremely interesting things in creating a continuum for victim services that goes beyond the scope of that. Now we have a convicted offender, and now you're cut loose, basically. So they've really worked on connectivity, and that's what we're looking for, is a continuum of care that spans the decision of arrest clear to the opposite end of the system, where we have people on supervision and even past that. Okay. So any questions about? I guess not. Okay. So we're not going to cover every single one of these things, but this is the kind of stuff that people ultimately are required to think about when they are working in this environment. So we have notification, and I saw a lot of people nodding their heads when I mentioned APRIS. That sounds great on the surface. What we're seeing now is that that technology is 10 years old and older. We're seeing a lot of failures now in the notification systems that were originally bought in to by different agencies, and that includes both the county level and the state level. So we're seeing a lot of movement now where people are designing their own notification systems based partially on what APRIS has done, but also partially on the very negative experience that some victims have had with that. So if you can imagine at midnight getting a phone call telling you that your offender has escaped, right? And then finding out 2 days later that that was not a legitimate phone call. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
The one more thing that I would add in regarding VINE, which is what Oregon has, is that victims have rights via Constitution, the Oregon Constitution, as well as statutes. And so the right to notification, VINE does not take care of that notification for either the counties or DOC or the parole board. That's not what it's meant for. It doesn't absolve us of our responsibility. VINE are most people familiar with VINE? So confidential, anonymous, so nobody knows if they have registered or not. But I think there's a lot of misinformation about what VINE is and what it can't and what it can do. And a lot of people, again, just because of lack of education and awareness, thinking, oh, we don't have to do that because VINE does it for us. So this is my opportunity to maybe try to stop some of the misinformation out there, is that VINE is kind of this additional tool for a victim, but it is not the one-all be-all, and that nobody else has to do much with victims because VINE is in place. So not only because of the reasons that Lorie mentioned, but just also through victims' rights, it is tied to certain agencies, and we'll talk more about that later.
So just to give you a basic overview here, so notification, which we've just talked about, that's a basic right under the federal statute. Now, most states have at least most of these rights now in their state constitutions. The federal Bill of Rights basically says all of this, that you have a right to notification, you have a right to information, and that means information about the course of your case, right? Input into that process, which means you get to appear in court, you get to talk to the DA, you get to appear at a parole hearing. So input can be any of those things and a lot of other things as well. Participation in your case, right? And the ability to make some decisions. Restitution. Some states are very aggressive about collecting restitution. In the state of California, you can't actually parole until your restitution is paid. So everybody always says, how do you get blood out of a turnip? Well, guess what? These people find the money if their release is contingent on them paying the restitution. So protection and safety, so that means safety planning, an idea of when your offender's getting out, the ability to plan for that, which brings us to the kind of the reentry connection here, right? I have a product up here, which I think there might even be enough of these discs for everybody. This is also on our website, but it's a broadcast that we did about offenders and reentry, and the idea of incorporating victims into that process when offenders reenter. Now, that's not to prevent them from coming back, but it's to prepare people in a way that makes sense for both the safety of the victim and the returning individual who's now leaving custody. And then, did you want to say something about victim transition protocol, or?
I mean, I think it's more of wanting to, like Lorie mentioned, it's not about preventing individuals from returning from the community. It's that preparation work. And so a lot of times when people think about victims' rights in the contents of essentially offender rights, there's this fear that you're trying to take away from offenders, and that's how we're going to get some more rights to victims. And it's really not. It's really about just leveling out that playing field, because offenders have a lot of rights, as they should. I've heard Meg Garvin of the NCVLI, the National Crime Victims Law Institute, has this great example, which I've since borrowed from her. And essentially is how many, just by show of hands, not word for word, but just generally speaking, you know your Miranda rights. You know the first couple of words, right? You see it on TV. I won't ask if anybody's had to do it themselves. But at the same level, now raise your hand if you know what your rights are as a crime victim in Oregon. Some, yeah. And so that's just kind of this example of it's just about bringing that awareness because of the victim's experience and the impact to that victim when somebody does harm somebody in our community. And when Lorie was talking about that kind of continuum of services, I think for us, those of us working in the post-sentencing, post-conviction world, whether it's DOC, the parole board, or community corrections, it's really getting to a culture shift of recognizing that victims are they're a consumer of our system as well. So it's not just offenders and the stakeholders and offenders' families, it's actually the victims as well. And then I say, even if you're light in the empathy department, there are actually some rights that say we have to be doing some of this work, such as information, notification, and so on.
So have we sold you on this yet, or should we move into our Amway presentation?
There's a pyramid.
It's too bad neither one of us are passionate about this. So one of the things that I wanted to ask, are there any POs in here at all? Anybody does supervision? Okay. How effective are you at preventing your offender from contact with your victim in an interfamilial offense?
It's really difficult. I mean, it's all individual. And I know that sometimes the victim wants the contact also. So it's really difficult. We're not there 24/7.
Right.
So anyway, what I was saying, it's difficult because each situation is different, and sometimes the victim does want contact, and then it gets ugly there. I have had one client that is scared to death of, the perpetrator, that he's going to come in at night. And so we arranged with local police to stop by her apartment, knock on the door, "Are you okay?" She said, "If my car's there and I don't answer, you have the right to break in." So I work with local law enforcement also if I do have a victim that's terrified of the perpetrator coming back to harm. So it's a case-by-case basis,
Okay.
Working with the individual and then local law enforcement. Like I said, I'm not there 24/7. Does that answer that?
Yep, thank
Okay.
you. So this, in one respect, we're not talking about situations where it's kind of stranger danger. In many cases, we're talking about interfamilial cases where we are saying you can't have contact with your victim, but in fact, both the victim and the offender want to have that. Now, I realize that we're all about reentry. Don't we think that's part of reentry? How can we do that more effectively? If that's an appropriate relationship for those two people to continue, which in some cases it might be. I'm not a huge fan of family reintegration as it's sold right now, but I do think we need to start thinking about that, because talking about employment and all of these other resources that people have, what is the one fundamental resource we have? It's our family usually. So if the rules that we're creating say that you can't see your victim, and that happens to be your wife, we have a real challenge there to try to do that in a safe way for both those entities. And in some cases, maybe that's the worst possible thing. You don't want those people to have contact. But I think we've gotten so into you're prohibited from this. It's just the most common thing ever, that you can't have contact. Okay.
Well, and the other thing I would add, and obviously domestic violence cases are going to be very differently and should be treated very differently, but when a no contact order is issued, typically the victim is not going to be asked about that. It's just going to be a standard condition, and they don't really get to have a lot of input or say on how they feel, whether it's, because not every case is going to be a stranger as the offender. A lot of it's going to be whether it's a relative, a family member, a friend. And so for that person, the no contact order may not be very realistic, but then more importantly, just for that individual victim's healing. What if part of their healing, or they have questions about the offender, they want to know what's going on, and when you have that no contact order, at times it unintentionally is a disservice to the victim as well.
Well, and if that didn't already bake your noodle, you might you might think about some of the other dynamics that are in play here that we just don't usually consider. For example, are you, as a jail or a prison, allowing that victim to visit the offender? Is that victim actually on their visiting list? Believe it or not, in a lot of systems, both state and county, that victim's allowed to visit up until the time that person goes to probation or parole, right? So they did a 180-day rider, now they're out in the community, suddenly they can't have contact anymore. That doesn't make any sense. That's extremely schizophrenic of us. So we're either going to allow the contact or we're not. So we see a lot of DOCs right now who are looking at their visiting policies, trying to make those determinations about safety, and those unfortunate situations where we had a murder in the visiting room of a DV-related case. Institutions are afraid of seeing those things happen. So, okay, so if I haven't convinced you enough, everybody's sort of familiar with the beginning of this schematic, of the arrest part, of the pretrial status of the offender, and what happens to the victim during that time frame. Who's in charge of that? We don't know? Who takes care of the victim on the front end of the system? DA, prosecutors. In some cases, where's my sane person? Yes. So we have some things going on the front end of the system. We may have something set up as a protocol if a person is diverted from incarceration or detention, right? There may be some supervision there. There may be some conversations with the victim. We move into the charging phase, the plea phase. And by the way, some people, if their case is pled out, in some jurisdictions, they're no longer considered a victim in that case. So the services just go away, right? That's not all right. That's not really okay, right? And if a prosecutor decides to charge on one case but not on another, then that ancillary victim may not get victim services. That's not right either. So there's a lot of work to be done in this area. So then the trial and the sentencing, right? We know who's providing those services usually. And then they go to local or state corrections. And this is where it really falls off. Because in many places, the DAs do not provide information to corrections because they see it as a breach of that victim's confidentiality. How in the world are we supposed to provide services to that person if we have no idea who they are or how to get a hold of them? So there's a bunch of different strategies in play to correct that falling off the system. But if you just look at this as, in my mind, 2/3 of the activities go on after the conviction, right? There are many services that could be provided to a victim after that. Now, why do you think that doesn't happen? I'm sorry? The victim's not compliant. Yes, that could be. That could certainly be, right? But why are we so front-end heavy? The laws require it. Well, I'm not sure that I've ever seen it graded that way. That's more important to notify you during the court phase. I haven't actually seen that. I mean, it's all important. There isn't anything that says you're only going to get notified on this front end of the system. Could it have anything to do with the machine that we all work inside of? The machine that's focused on the offender, the machine that's focused on moving a case through the court system, right? And then we focus on the offender afterwards because we're doing all these things with the offender, hoping that they won't create new victims, right? But somehow we forget that the victim still has some pretty significant rights. And you're right, some victims are not compliant. Some victims basically just want to forget what happened to them. So that is a dynamic of this.
Like what is portrayed by society as well, like showing that we're providing those services in the beginning to make face. So,
do you suppose it has anything to do with cooperation in a prosecution? See, that's one. Are there any DAs in here? Because I have a real problem with some things that are said in that environment. For example, go ahead and testify. We're going to put this guy away for the rest of his life. How often does that really happen? 98% of offenders return to the street. So to tell a victim that is unconscionable. All right. How are we doing? Time-wise, we're doing okay. Okay, so we do have one survey research project that we wanted to just bring to your attention. Denise and I had a conversation about this earlier today. This is worth looking at. It's an interesting research study, but people who have experienced violent offenses were not a significant part of this survey. So what does that tell us? That if it's a lower level crime, if it's say a burglary, a theft, something that, maybe a drug offense that involved ancillary individuals, this is probably a legitimate survey, right? But if you're talking to people who have been victims of serious violent offenses, I really have to wonder how these numbers would play out at that point. So just something to think about. There is not a whole lot of research out there in the victim world, so it makes it really difficult to talk about evidence-based practices with this topic area. It's very difficult to collect data from victims, partly because of the confidentiality issues. So, all right. Oh, I wasn't supposed to show you that. Okay, what do you think some of the challenges are to involving victims in the process of offender reentry and involving them in obtaining some of their rights? And what happens in the post-conviction setting? What are those challenges?
I think there's lots of things going on. If you backtrack to what you said, if the prosecution ultimately sees and uses victims as a tool in their prosecution process, so then the victim gets to the end of that process and feels discarded, as you've kind of alluded to, there may then be several years of period when the offender is in prison. There's been little to no contact with the victim. Suddenly, so there's no engagement with that victim during the interim process, and suddenly they're getting a call from somebody saying, "Oh, your offender, the perpetrator's being released. We'd like to talk to you about this." Why would they engage if there's been no ongoing involvement, checking in, contact, things like that?
Very good. Thank you. Okay, what else? Yes, sir.
I think some victims just want to forget.
That's true. That's very true. We talk in this area, we talk a lot about being victim-centered and trying to make sure that the victim gets what they need. But that is definitely one of the drawbacks to that, is they may actually not want any of the contact. And they may change that over time. So initially, they know the guy's locked up. They know he's not going to be an immediate threat to them. They just don't want to think about it anymore, right? But in 5 or 10 years, when that person's up for parole, suddenly they're going, I don't think I want him to get out. what do I need to do to make sure that doesn't happen? So they do become disconnected from the system for a variety of reasons, partly by their own choice, but also partly because in some of these cases there's a significant length of time there between conviction and when their next maybe period of service needs to happen. Was there someone else?
There is. And I'm glad you touched on what he was saying, because I'm down in Lane County here in Oregon, and I run our reentry center. So that's one of the reasons why I wanted to come in here. Because I think that the difficult thing is when somebody does 10 years, and the DAs, most of us know, that you might have half the DAs working that may have even been there at that time. So it's when that person's being released, and then the difficulty of trying to re-engage if that person has moved on and tried to move on. And so it's trying to, again, we're in Oregon, I don't know about DC, we always hear you guys have plenty of money.
I don't know about it either.
But we have, very resource driven. So we're very reactionary, and that's typically because of budgets.
Thank you. Kelly Tom back here.
I'm not sure if this is answering your question, but if you say the challenges, it always seems to me, that the challenge, we have so much focus on rehabilitation, on helping people who are offending to recover and reintegrate. I don't think we take that approach with victims. We give them rights, we give them hearing, but I don't think we go into the healing or recovery process. That seems to me to be a big challenge.
Thank you. That's very true. We see these sort of pockets around the country of people doing restorative justice work, but most of that is not serious violent offenses. Most of that are lower level offenses that have really strong restorative justice components to them. Anything else that we thought of?
I think victims value anonymity, and by accessing victim services, or even in our case coming to the parole board and wanting to be listed as a victim, they surrender that. And there's fear of being found. In some cases, if someone's been incarcerated for an extended period of time, they don't want the offender to know where they are, and coming forward, receiving services might expose them to that.
Thank you for that. That is very true. Victims, we talk about not re-victimizing people, and we say that like we really know what that means. But I don't think any of us, unless we have been a direct victim of a serious violence offense, can appreciate the long-term effect of that and the amount of inner strength it takes to heal from something like that. And they may never want to encounter that offender again, but they're going to have to decide, and in the tipping point of, do I want to keep them locked up by appearing? I know in Oregon, that's not the case, right? You guys don't, yeah. But in many states it is. The victim appearing at the parole hearing has a real dramatic effect on what happens with that individual. So, okay, So here were the ones that we had listed. We do have some other things going on, like, for example, if it wasn't bad enough to not have the confidentiality thing ironed out between the DA's office and the detention or corrections folk, we also have this huge push right now to figure out data systems that are secure enough to contain some of the information that we need to serve victims. Because if you can imagine, you're a victim of crime, you're told that you can sign up for Vine, and you do that. And you might get some of the notifications that you need. But then the status of your offender changes, and you're told, well, you were already signed up for Vine, but that was a different system, so now you have to sign up for this thing over here. And then you sign up for that. And then later you hear, oh, I'm not getting notified because I didn't sign up for that third service, right? And so it's not very streamlined, to put it mildly. So we're working on some different projects, which Denise is going to talk to you about, one that is going on in your state, that might help with that. Continuity of services so that victims don't bear the responsibility of having to do these things over and over and over again. And every time they change addresses, they have to notify somebody so that they can get their notification, which is their legal right, right? It's almost like the DMV.
And one more thing, Oregon, when it comes to victims' rights, because it does vary state by state, some rights for victims are automatic. Most of them have to be requested. And so Oregon is essentially like an opt-in system. And so for a victim to want those rights, they actually have to invoke the rights, let the appropriate agency know that they do. And so the example that Lorie gave, if somebody goes to prison, they might have to ask for the same right 3 different times, because the post-conviction agencies, we don't do a really great job of communicating that to each other. Lorie alluded to some of those reasons about people being protective of victim information, as they should be, because it is very sensitive, but then needing to leverage that out with the unintended consequences for that victim of just asking more things of them than they already have experienced.
Thanks. I just want to show you the website, which is public and anyone can visit this one. So I have some of my business cards up here. Maybe someday it'll come up. There it is. Okay, so anybody can go in here, get some information about post-conviction services. I also have a flyer up here, and as I said, the DVD is up here. There's a lot of good information on here about different services. There's a lot of things. If you scroll down this page, there's a whole bunch of resources under those lower tabs. So you can go in there, you can see other agency policies, you can see how some other people have been able to bridge some of these gaps that we have between service providers as people move through the system. And I'm going to skip that for a second. And then I wanted to just show you this. Since I only have one PO in the room, I'm not going to belabor this point, but we do have a desktop guide now, which is meant to encourage POs to talk more productively with victims when they call on the phone. So here in many agencies, the common scenario is, I'm the PO, I'm working with the offender, I don't want to talk to you because you're going to take up too much of my time. You're the victim, there's other people that can help you, it's not me. Okay, wouldn't you like to know, though, with your caseload, if a victim is feeling unsafe? If they encountered the individual at the grocery store, or there was some other interchange that occurred, to me, that's more successful supervision because now you have more information about what that individual's behavior might be, right? And I'm not even talking about DV cases just in general. So that would be handy to have at our desk just to grab it real quick. Well, yeah, this is electronic, so you can get in here and it has a lot of really cool functionality to it. So if you see something on here, oh, geez, sorry about that. If you see something on here and you click on the link inside the guide, it will immediately take you to that section of the guide. So it's very interactive. It's a great tool. It has some caseload-specific information, but it also has a lot of information in general. Now, I've also heard about people using this as a tool to open the discussion with other agency staff about why this is important, what kind of benefit you can get from actually talking to a victim, instead of just saying to them, well, I don't really have time to talk to you right now. Because many times what a victim wants when they call you on the phone is they just want to know that you're there, that you're actually supervising someone. Do you have to tell them everything about that person's case plan? Not at all. So, okay. Was this you or me? That's still you. Well, I think I actually said most of that. So that's just about the guide. But like I said, if I don't have a room full of POs, we don't have to talk about that. But I am going to pass this off to Denise. Did anybody have any questions about NIC's work or anything that we're doing? We're really trying to keep the national conversation going partly because I want to make sure that my federal partners, which means OVW and OVC and some of the other OV what have yous, are aware of the fact that everyone know about Vision 21? Anybody looked at Vision 21? Okay, it doesn't even talk about post-conviction in it, which is horrifying to me. So that's one of my federal partners who completely ignored the entire end of the system. So, yes, sir.
Yeah, I think it's more relevant to maybe what you're doing in Washington. You mentioned that there's not a lot of, I guess, research and evidence on victims in needs, interest, rights. There's done a huge amount of research in Europe, various European countries on that you could maybe access. The European Union has passed a victims directive, which mandates much more of what you've been talking about, a kind of an end-to-end from arrest through to release, mandates for how countries should support victims and services that they should have access to. On restorative justice, I'd be interested to know how much more is happening. Again, in England and in South Africa, there's been some very good studies on the use of restorative justice, victim offender mediation, family group conferencing, where over 85% satisfaction for both victim and offender, and also over things like 20% reductions in reoffending, which obviously means less victims. And there's a growing body of evidence that, in fact, restorative approaches are even more successful with more serious crimes where there is an actual, there's a known victim and offender where it's not about robbery, which is, we usually use it safely with low-level crimes. There's a growing body of evidence that's even more powerful on more serious crimes.
I really appreciate you bringing that up. And there's also some good stuff that Canada's doing and also that's going on in New Zealand and Australia. So I appreciate you, mentioning that. I try to serve my constituents, and it's really tricky sometimes when you start talking about what they're doing in other countries to get buy-in for that. But we certainly have some great examples of things that have gone on. Tom, you had a comment.
Yeah, I guess that was my comment as well. Because I like the rights-based approach. Victims have a right to be notified, and I think that's important structure. But it was how to move the conversation into the recovery, into the healing, and whatever. I don't know if they're the right words or not, but how to deal with the trauma. The trauma and. Trying to get people back again from the damage. That's kind of the question I would have. How would we shift that conversation in that direction a bit more?
Well, it is very tricky, because as my sane person over here said, sometimes the victim doesn't want to participate in this. And so it's really important to stay victim focused. To give victims some options, because that's how victims regain some sense of stability in their lives, is when they think they do have choices, that not everything has been taken away from them. But if you can't do anything else, if you leave here today and you cannot do anything else, please think about supporting the people in your agency who do this work, because they really need you. They need you to support them, because this is really hard work. And if you are that person, reach out to some of those people who work with you and let them know that you need some kind of support from them, because it's really, really difficult to do this work without peers. So, all right, I'm going to turn this over to Denise.
All right, so I'm going to switch us down a notch over to more what's happening here in Oregon. So in community corrections, so I'm not, because when we think of post-sentencing, post-conviction, that's including DOC and the parole board, and I'm going to speak more specifically on community corrections, which is where I work. We have what I like to call a lot of opportunities to do better for victims. Historically, I think in community corrections, again, like I mentioned earlier, we don't really think of or haven't really thought of victims as a consumer of our systems, haven't really thought about the experience that a victim might have and how that's not going to just stop at the time of conviction. for them. And I think, and again, I'm speaking in generalizations, for community corrections, when we think of victims, I think Lorie said it, we think of no new victims. We think of reducing recidivism, which means no newer victims in the community. And obviously that is good. That is good for everybody. But when that's the sole focus when we think of victims, at that point, the person that's already been harmed, that's already suffered the damages, that's the person that gets forgotten. And so that's where some of my focus is going to go on now. So OACCD, Lorie's talking about each state does it differently. In Oregon, with 36 counties, we have 36 counties doing it differently. So again, it just doesn't seem to get any easier because of the inconsistencies, which is one of the challenges that she spoke of earlier. Another challenge for community corrections is going to be, which this is a reality for everybody, is lack of resources and staff. Out of the 36 counties that I mentioned, for parole and probation, there's only 5 counties that have any staff designated for victim services. And so for a lot of these officers, you're kind of on your own trying to work with victims. And you may not have gotten training about that, you probably haven't gotten training on what the rights and what you should be doing to make sure that you're in compliance. And so we've approached our OACCD, which is all the directors for community corrections here in Oregon, and essentially started getting buy-in from them. It was myself and Helen O'Brien, who works for the Department of Justice in the Crime Victim Services Division, and a lot of that started with just basic education. So it was going to OACCD and talking to the directors about the victims' rights that continue post-conviction, because again, it was never on their radar. That's never been the focus. The primary focus is offender rehabilitation and trying to reduce recidivism. And that's where my comment of Vine, we don't do that because Vine does, like that came out of that meeting. And so it really was trying to do some education of actually that's not how it works and providing them with that information. And so as a result, when I first started doing this job, again in Multnomah County, it's been about 4 years now, and I made a comment about it's kind of a lonely place because in the post-conviction world, there's really not, specifically with parole and probation, not a lot of staff and doing this work. Most of the advocates were, again, based either in the community or in the DA's office. And so we, about 3 years ago, informally started meeting at that point, the 4 counties that had staff designated. So it was Multnomah, Marion County, Clackamas County, Washington County. Klamath County recently came on board, I think last year, with hiring an advocate, and then Yamhill County is in the works. And so at that point, not wanting to be specifically only for parole and probation, we then included and reached out to DOJ because they do have a victim services division at the Department of Justice here in Oregon, as well as DOC and the parole board, because each of those agencies have a staff person designated for victim services as well. Like Lorie mentioned earlier, for DOC, for example, it is one victim specialist for the whole agency. And so already you can imagine that workload is just going to be it's going to be really challenging. So what we started doing was just, again, informally on our own, meeting on a quarterly basis. That's when we approached the directors and we were able to get support from them. We are now recognized as a subgroup of OACCD, which I think is very important, because they are open to hearing on ways that we can improve for victims. And even the counties that are not going to have the resources to hire staff, now this network, the PCAN, what we like to call ourselves, we can be available to those smaller counties, whether it be training, resources. For example, like we're working on a toolkit. We send out letters to victims when an offender gets put on probation or parole, again, asking them if they want those rights that they have to request, because it's not automatic, specifically to notification. And so to be able to be a resource for those smaller counties that aren't going to have any staff designated. And then the desktop guide that Lorie mentioned is just a great tool for us to use as well. And so when I started doing in trying to explore the post-prison, post-conviction world, it just became like all shades of gray because, again, some of the rights are not automatic. They have to be requested. Some of them, via the Oregon Constitution, honestly can be very vague. And what I mean by that is that they can be interpreted differently by different counties, and we find that happening here in Oregon. And so this is how I became connected with Lorie, was a couple of years ago. DCJ requested technical assistance from NIC, and Lorie was our contact person to kind of help figure out in this post-conviction world, how can we better streamline some of our efforts, because we knew that we had a lot of challenges and a lot of room for improvement. And so in November of 2014, we received the technical assistance from NIC, and at that point, we had the 4 primary goals are written up there. I will briefly explain what they were. The first one was just gathering what are all the rights for crime victims in Oregon via the Oregon Constitution and via the statutes. And that essentially is going to be our baseline. Like, that's what we need to be hitting and kind of the bare minimum that we need to be providing for victims. And then we had a big mapping meeting that was held here in Oregon via NIC. We had a facilitator come out, and we had a room at DOJ, Crime Victim Services Division hosted us, and we had almost everybody in the room, and I'll get to the almost part in a minute. So we had DOC, parole board, crime victims' rights attorneys, victim advocates, both community-based and program-based. DOJ was there. We had different sizes, jurisdictions as far as community corrections went, and so we had Multnomah County, but we had a medium-sized county and a small rural county as well, because their experiences are going to be different on how they deal with victims. And essentially, we just sat on this board, and by the end of the day, we essentially mapped out that once an offender goes to prison, all the different places that the offender moves is essentially another opportunity that the victim can get lost in the system and try to get and lose where the offender is in the system, and essentially lose track and be left out unintentionally at that point. And so then from there, NIC, a bunch of us that were at that meeting went out to Washington, D.C. We had national experts on victims' rights essentially take a look at what we were doing in Oregon and give us feedback on what we were doing well and give us feedback on what we could certainly be improving on. And so then NIC also published the report about kind of what those findings were. And so one of the really great things about the work we did with NIC is that it really started getting us mainly involved in the post-conviction world together, and we continued the conversation even after NIC was done with the mapping process. And I'm specifically talking about DOC, the parole board, and then DCJ. National Crime Victims Law Institute. Are many folks here familiar with NCVLI? So I'll briefly explain. They are a national organization giving technical assistance regarding victims' rights issues to victims' rights attorneys. And we luck out extremely much because they're actually based out of Portland, Oregon, and they are attached to the Lewis and Clark Law School. So they are a huge resource for us. And so NIC kind of became part of this Oregon project as really maintaining that victim lens throughout the whole process, because each of the agencies, we want to do right by victims and we want to do better, but we each also have our own items that we're tasked with, and the victim may not be at the top of it. And so NCVLI was very important to have at the table, again, to have that victim voice present and be a part of this process. And so then the Oregon project, we continued to meet, and again, try to come up with a solution on how we can better come up with a system for this. After Washington, D.C., we approached Deputy District Attorney Rod Underhill and asked if he wanted to be a part of these efforts. And he immediately agreed, because essentially we presented, your agency, your department does all this great work with victims, and by giving them resources and information and support, and then once your office is done with them because the case has been resolved, your advocates are going off to the next cases, and those victims essentially are kind of left alone to fend for themselves. We had one more trip out of NIC, and that's with Deputy DA Underhill. Some of us flew to Minnesota in February, so it was actually 1 year ago, like now. And again, it was DA Underhill, myself, and Scott Taylor, my director from DCJ, the parole board. Michael Wu is the current chair, and we had representatives from DOC. The reason we went to Minnesota is that when we were in Washington, D.C., and meeting with those national experts, we heard of a program through Minnesota's DOC called the Choice Program. And I think Lorie mentioned earlier that they have a really great system within their DOC, and it's automated, and it's very victim-centered, and so a victim can go in there and attempt to get information, they can get information about the offender, they communicate it to their parole agents, but Minnesota's system is very different than Oregon's, where they actually have a parole department and a probation department are by the counties, and in Oregon, the counties are going to be supervising both of those cases. If at any time anybody has any questions, please let me know, because I looked at the time, and so I'm starting to blow through some slides real quick. And so that brought us, when we came back from Minnesota, it was we know what we need. We need a portal. We started throwing this word portal around, and I'm the least IT person, so I really shouldn't be saying that, but of this idea of we need an automated system, like one point of entry that essentially will, when you think of the post-conviction agencies, we're very siloed, and it can be something that maybe could bridge us all together. So instead of the victim having to go individually to each one as the offender moves through, they can just go to one place. Code for America is a nonprofit out of the Bay Area. My very simplistic description of them is that they work with government agencies and partner with them to bring them up to speed with technology. That's not what government is known for. And so we submitted a grant application last year with this idea of this victim portal. We're called the Multnomah Partners, which consists of the 5 agencies. And we actually got selected for them to essentially build us this portal. Code for America came up in October and met with all the county partners. And the thing about Code for America that to me I find so impressive, and I will disclose, I've been a government employee. That's my career has been in government. I've never worked in the nonprofit and certainly not in the tech sector. But instead of typically government agencies are going to say, we need this, and now we're going to find a vendor to match what we think we need done, where Code for America takes a very innovative approach. So instead, they want to identify the problem and then start talking to those impacted, start talking to the users, what they need, and then build it from there. And in our case, the users are going to be the crime victims here in Oregon. And so they're going to be up here starting February 27th, and they're going to be doing a lot of interviews to find out what the victims' needs are. They're going to be meeting with all the stakeholders, so the 5 partners that I've mentioned, but they're going to be talking with victims' rights attorneys, with DOJ, to really kind of come up with this idea of a portal. And what I've since learned, since I've been working with Code for America, is that I thought I had an idea of what this was going to look like, but the reality is I don't. And that's because it hasn't been built yet, but it's also going to be based on the needs of the victims, not what I think the victims should need. We need to make sure that we maintain that we're in compliance with victims' rights. But again, it's going to be based on the research they're going to do. And so essentially they send 2 fellows up and they do residence here in Multnomah County for about 3 weeks and start doing all their research with everybody. And then they go back to the Bay Area and they essentially just start building. So I don't know if this is an app, if it's a website, again, it hasn't been built yet. So that's very exciting, but also it can be very overwhelming, to think of this project. There are a lot of unanswered questions. So for example, this is supposed to be a 6-month project. We need to figure out once the portal is built, if that's what it's going to be, where is it going to be housed? It's starting off as a Multnomah County project because that's where the partners were all working out of. But if this is truly going to be for all victims, then it needs to go statewide, because we know that our offenders, especially once they're post-conviction, they move from county to county. And so it needs to be built, and they are very aware that this is a concern of ours, and so it needs to have the ability to be able to go statewide. So I know that there are a few more slides left, but we're not going to get to them because I already got the sign. And so does anybody have any questions about that? And my actually ask of you all before we wrap up is if you work with victims, if you think that they would be interested in speaking to one of the fellows about their experience, because in the world of trying to be mindful and not re-traumatizing victims, we're not going to start cold calling people and say, hey, you want to talk to some fellows about building a big portal? And so I've reached out to victims' rights advocates or victims' rights attorneys about individuals they maybe have worked with in the past, and maybe if they're at a place where they would want to speak to fellows about their experience with the criminal justice system. The fellows are going to be doing a lot of shadowing. They're going to spend a whole day at the DA's office working with their advocates to, again, better understand that victim's experience so that it can influence them in what they're going to build. Or they're going to spend a day at the parole board and attending parole hearings. Again, just to kind of see, because we know by the time an offender and therefore that victim ends in our world, there's a whole world they've already experienced, and typically it hasn't gone very well for them. Any questions about that at all, as I just rambled really fast? So the question was, are we focusing on adult victims or child victims? So the focus is for, I will say, the victims of adult offenders. Does that answer your question? Because if it's a child victim, then it's the parent or the guardian of that child victim essentially becomes the victim that has rights attached to them. Did I answer the question?
Yeah, I think for a lot of, I'm thinking like sexual abuse crimes, perhaps that child, by the time that offender is in the post-conviction stage, that child is now an adult of 18 years. And so if you're asking only adults who are taking care of smaller children and advocating for them, then the actual victim of the abuse, that child, is not getting a voice in the development of this resource. And it might be nice to ask potentially some children who maybe are now of adult age, if that works better for your study, what they would have liked to have had access to as a child to give them rights to.
Yeah, and I guess the one thing that I should specify is that the portal is going to be focused on the post-sentencing, post-conviction world. You know, some of the questions is, you know, how does this start? You know, and ideally, if we had something from the very beginning and that could follow somebody through, that would be much better. But we did have a focus-specific area, and it is tied more to notification and information are typically the majority of the rights, because there's not a lot of other resources that are coming with this project. Does that answer the question a little bit at all? Or okay.
I do think that's a fabulous idea, though, and we hear a lot, especially with victim offender dialogue. You know, people who were victimized as children who are now adults want to participate in that process, but they may or may not have been fully informed about some things when they were younger. So I'm really glad that you brought that up, because we do tend to forget, especially when the offender's been down for a long time, that victim may not have been an adult when it happened. So okay, so before you leave, I do have these DVDs up here. Both Denise and I have our cards out, and then there's those flyers. I put the resource addresses up there. There's a ton of stuff on our website, on the NICIC.gov website, that you can access. As always, everything we do is free to you. So you can order DVDs for nothing. We'll mail them to you. So anything you want off of there, you know, we're totally about helping you. So.
Okay, thank you so much to our speakers. Please join me in thanking our speakers today, and we've got one more session.